After finishing Kentucky Route Zero, I was left feeling strange. Now, I mean that in the best way possible. Despite having no gameplay and having a 10-hour long runtime that is mostly just reading, I can't recall it ever feeling that way. This probably has to do with the fact that I played it similarly to how you read a book, finishing a chapter or two before taking a break so I don't get burned out or start skimming. And thanks to the game's almost episodic nature, it never really mattered how long the break was. Yes, there is an overarching plot with major events worth remembering, but since most of the dialogue choices are up to you, the player, many times the things said are vague and the conversations feel self-contained. Due to this and the game's heavy and foggy atmosphere, trying to recall events of the game is almost like remembering a hazy dream. Pretty much everything in the game has a weird, poetic energy to it. The characters say things that you'll either get or you won't, but even when you don't, that doesn't mean the words are lost. I feel like someday in the future I'll experience something or hear somebody speak and then be struck by a strange familiarity. Though, even through this ethereal mode the game has going on all the way until the end, after the credits started rolling, I felt really impacted. I was left feeling off. After finishing Kentucky Route Zero, I decided that I have to speak about this game, but the problem is, this might be the worst game for YouTube video essay ever made. Usually I make these things to talk about interesting subjects, or so more people can know about the things that I think are really cool. And because of that, I really want to talk about Kentucky Route Zero. But there's a problem. This game really be a piece of abstract art, similar to a poem or a painting. The events that happen in the game are vague enough that you can really base it off anything and you'd be correct. The game also makes overt references to famous works of literature over the years, as well as bringing up specifically American subjects, so if you would strip away all of the supposed
indie art game hipster bait
pretext, you would be left with a pretty somber piece of American literature. Which might make my earlier statement make no sense. I mean, people talk about books all the time. Some people talk about the media and art so much that it almost begins to define who they are as a person. So clearly what I said earlier makes no sense. But the problem is, after finishing Kentucky Route Zero, I was speechless. It wasn't a speechlessness born from amazement or any worldview-changing feeling, it was just that there wasn't anything to say. I was speechless because there was nothing to speak about. I guess a good way to start is from the beginning. The game opens with you, Conway, riding around Interstate 65 looking for a place called 5 Dogwood Drive, but no matter where he looks, 5 Dogwood Drive is nowhere to be found. He's looking for this place so he can drop off a shipment of antiques from the place he works for. Traveling with him, an old mutt that you can name. I called him Homer because he just felt like a Homer. But Homer doesn't really matter much, and by the end of the game neither will Conway, but that depends on you. Throughout this game, entire events, conversations, and characters can go about differently depending on how you see fit. Just pick what feels right to you, and it's the truth of the situation. You might have no freedom on what happens when, but you can always control how what happens when. For you, maybe Homer was named Blue, or had no name at all. Maybe you never met this crazy theater guy. Maybe Conway got down to check out a site. Maybe he never did. The gameplay of this game is all just choosing options. He said this, she said that. He went there and talked to him. They never went there and never spoke with anybody. This is where trying to sell a game like this fails horribly, because how do you tell someone in the year 2021 that one of your favorite games was pretty much a choose-your-own-adventure book that's actually just a piece of American literature? I guess what I'm trying to say is if you like reading... Oh yeah man, cover a video game book that came out a year ago, that'll get the people watching. If you like reading and whatever is going on here, then you need to play this game. Insert the quote of the generic internet man here, but for real this time. Yeah, spoiler-free is usually the best way to go for any piece of media, but for something this subjective, that statement could not be more true. The way Kentucky Route Zero hits emotionally varies from player to player. The last thing I would want is for my view of the game to be seen as correct. The rest of this video will just be tales from the zero or things that stuck out to me. Little interesting bits that make up what I thought about the game. I would say click off if the game seems interesting at any point, but I mean, it really is just a book. Not that many people out there are the types to do that type of thing anyways, so maybe just settle down and listen anyways. Now, back to that problem. Where do I begin? Well, there is something to be said about this game's art style. In the parts where you are a character, all the people have these fuzzy, blurry features going on. It gives everything this textureless, dreamy quality, a trait shared with the parts of the game you spend inside vehicles. They all use this white lines on muted black background art style. Everything is only made up of outlines, the roads are just lines in the darkness guiding your character wherever they are headed. Occasionally, these stretches of road get broken up by events. Sometimes the characters get down to investigate, or sometimes they just bring them up in passing. Reminds me a lot of a late night drive back home, when the things outside the car window all start to blend together into this white noise of features, occasionally one feature sticking out and registering with you. Which is also true about the quotes in the game. Maybe all the text just becomes mind-numbing or whiffs its mark, but randomly there will be this line that just makes me go, whoa. I remember at some point this character is thinking out loud and apologizes to someone in the room for not noticing them. Then the guy responds,
There's no shame in it, because after all, talking is just the end form of thinking. People always think before they speak, but rarely ever think while speaking. Where do the thoughts go then?
This game also has a pretty good sense of humor sometimes, albeit a bit dry. There's this one quote later into the game that I even use now because I just think it's really funny. During the last interlude, some strange things start happening, and one of the characters goes, makes sense, Saturn's in retrograde. And the girl you're playing as thinks, what? Before agreeing blindly. Then later, more things start happening and somebody else goes, yeah, makes sense, Saturn's in retrograde. And again the character's like, why do you know? What does that mean? This happens like 2 more times before finally, by the end of the story, somebody asks why all these strange things are happening, and your character just goes, heard Saturn's in retrograde, and the person just responds, oh, makes sense. In another point, much earlier into the game, these guys are talking about what's on TV, that being a Christian documentary about Noah's Ark. One of them asking, wait, how come there weren't any dinosaurs on the Ark? And the other responds, there's probably an explanation, but I haven't gone to church since I dated that church girl. Like, it's not trying at all to be a certified gutbuster, but it's filled with the same mundane silliness you see in real life all the time. Fuck, dude. The whole story is honestly really down to earth, despite mostly taking place in some made-up place with no rules. Like, it takes place on Earth and it follows similar rules, but every time it breaks them with supernatural events or legit anything that happens inside the zero, the character just sort of respond with
Yep. Yep.
But mostly those lighter moments come from the interludes. Speaking of which, these happen throughout the game between the main acts and usually have something to do with the upcoming events for the next chapter, and I love these things. In one of them you are this group of people looking around an impossible arts museum, and another you dial in on this landline that gives you Traveler's Guide on the Route Zero. But my personal favorite would have to be the entertainment. This bit could honestly stand on its own as a solo piece. It takes place from your perspective as a barfly, listening in on conversations happening in a bar filled with people telling tales and drinking their worries away, despite knowing that they are just digging deeper and deeper into debt. Slowly, the cracks start to form in their stories and tales until everything comes crashing down and they finally admit to the sad truths of their situation before, unfortunately, the debt collectors come knocking. Okay. I'm not speaking very speechless right now, I know. Sort of dancing around the issue. Here, allow me to tell you the tale of a man named Conway. Like I said earlier, the game opens up with him looking around the Interstate 65 for 5 Dogwood Drive, before the owner of a gas station tells him he should look for the zero. Over the course of the game, more and more people join Conway on his quest for 5 Dogwood Drive. At first it's just his dog, a dog as old as he is, then Shannon, a TV mechanic, Ezra, a boy that lost his family, and 2 robots that play music shows, being Junebug and Johnny. They've all got some reason to stick around at first, but slowly they lose track of that and just decide to stick around to find 5 Dogwood Drive. In the beginning you don't know much about Conway, but throughout the journey more and more bits and pieces of his past are to be revealed. As it turns out, he's a man drowning in debts, but not the literal kind. He used to be an alcoholic. This alcoholism ended up driving away his lover and co-worker Lisette, though they still kept in touch due to working at the same place. Eventually, this old lover of his would have a kid. Eventually, this kid would grow up and start doing jobs with Conway to help make some money. Conway and this kid would do odd jobs together, and get to know each other well, but one day Conway had woken up too drunk to do a roofing job, so the kid didn't in his place. On that job, the kid would slip and fall, losing his life. After that event, Conway swore off drinking and went dry, or so he says. All this information is given to you in a flashback where Conway and Lisette are reminiscing on past events before he goes off on his final delivery, where he has to drop off some antiques to some place called 5 Dogwood Drive. Here, they're talking about what happened to that kid, something that was beyond anybody's control. Some people call that an accident, a tragedy, or as I always see it, a shame. This debt of guilt is something that he'll never be able to pay off, no matter how long or hard he tries. It's all in the past now. The accident, Lisette, and soon, so will his job. The reason this is his final delivery is not because he's retiring, it's because his workplace has gone under. After this last delivery, he's got nowhere to go, but sadly or not so sadly, depending on how you look at it, he never gets to finish this last delivery. After an accident in Act 2, his leg becomes injured. He shrugs it off and says he can handle it, but eventually in Act 3, he blacks out from the pain. After which, Shannon demands they go see a doctor named Truman. When they get there, he gets his leg healed, but the medicine used wasn't cheap, and it's definitely nothing he could afford. He is forced to take on more debt, but at least his leg is slightly healed. Eventually, him and Shannon go into the Hard Times Distillery looking for directions. The Hard Times Distillery has been this floating force that's been talked about and brought up alongside people having to pay their debts, usually just referred to as those folks at Hard Times. All the workers from that place have this skeletal, ghostly appearance, similar to Conway's healed leg. While at the distillery, an officer gives them a tour of the place and tells Conway that right here will be his new job, since he seems to already have some debt to be paid due to his leg. He can get started right away, offering Conway a toast to celebrate. Then, a major plot twist happens. Throughout the story, you've been able to decide on things as small as how a character feels about the weather to things as big as how a character acts. When a choice is presented to you, you are deciding for the character, almost like their subconscious telling them what to do. But here and only here, this rule is broken. A prompt is brought up on whether or not Conway takes a shot, and despite how you feel about saying yes, this is something Conway just can't say no to. There was a choice there. Conway knows he could have said no, but that's just not something he would ever do. After this, Shannon forces them to leave because they had just come for directions, and after getting said directions, the advisor warns Conway something. The advisor says, yes, you can go ahead and leave, but you better get working on that debt soon. You'll have to pay for that shot of whiskey, and it was some of the good stuff, not just any old whiskey. From here on out, Conway keeps dipping back to his old habits and starts acting strange. The party members worry for him and try to keep an eye on him, but eventually, his debt catches up to him. While him and Shannon were alone in a lake, doing a favor for a friend, the people over at Hard Times come by and pick him up off screen. He is then seen floating off on a boat, just another faceless skeleton that'll work till the end of time for a debt he can never repay. In the end, his alcoholism took everything away from him, even his own life. After this, it's just a solemn ride back to the diner, where everybody is waiting. One of the party members of the group, Johnny, asks Shannon what happened to Conway, and she just responds, he's gone. Johnny commenting on how, despite not knowing him very well, he always did look like somebody that had somewhere else to go. Shannon then says that she has to go sit down. Then there's this amazing scenario about perspectives and what drives people, and while it was a great moment, the entire time I had this feeling like something wasn't right. Eventually, the diner lady asks Shannon if she wants a drink, and she responds no. She has somewhere to go. After standing up and walking away from the group, this song kicks in. A song that I could only reason as being for what happened to Conway. But the game gives you a prompt when you leave asking whether you want to go now or just listen for a while. And so I simply just let the music play, lost in thought. The song is called This World Is Not My Own, and it's a somber recreation of a classical gospel song that goes by the same name. It's about a man saying how this world isn't his home and heaven is the only place he could call home. And while the original song is more upbeat and springy, making it sound like the eternal afterlife is something to look forward to because God's heaven is a place anybody could call home. In this rendition of the song, the lyrics take a completely different meaning. Time and time again, the game shows you people struggling to make ends meet, taking on dangerous jobs where if anything were to happen to them, the higher-ups wouldn't even bat an eye. People are shown struggling to keep up with the bills, dreaming and dreaming of a brighter future where hopefully, if they just keep grinding away, maybe one day they'll achieve the dream they've always wanted, but the bills just keep coming, so they must just keep working. Those folks at Hard Times are most likely just people that have been caught in this cycle and have lost themselves to it. The eternal grind is something that's seen as righteous in the West, and people pride themselves on how hard they do it. But the sad truth is, there really is no end to the bills, not until the day you drop dead. And that's what this song sounds like. A man that's grown tired of the endless work and wishes to simply move on already. He can't call this world his home. Not anymore. His dreams, for whatever reason, haven't come true. Maybe they never will. Maybe he's gone too old, maybe he's let too many opportunities pass him by. Maybe fate just never had his interest in mind. Maybe his choices in life have never been the best. Either way, the world left him behind, and he hopes that the next one will be more accommodating. Maybe the only reason something like this impacted me so much is because Conway reminds me of an old man I used to know, who had the same problems and would eventually meet the same fate. People come and go, right? Lives rise and fall. But what would you call it if a life never had a chance to fall? No graceful descent, no crash and burn, not even a tumble. Just a flat line from a machine nobody was listening for, in a room nobody knew the number of, buried in a grave nobody will ever visit. I wonder sometimes what's more tragic, a life cut short or a life nobody knew about. In the end, they're the same thing, Just lives lost to time, or I guess a lifetime that became lost. Both a real tragedy. But I've never liked calling it that. I've always called it a shame. It's a shame what happened to Conway. A damn shame.
And I can't feel at home in this world anymore.
After feeling like I could move on, I went on with the story, Act 4 concluding with everybody finally making it to the staircase leading to 5 Dogwood Drive. Sadly, there was no way of getting a truck up a staircase, so they had to move all the antiques out on foot and leave the truck behind. After exiting the hole, it's a tranquil scene. A quiet town that has roads, none of which lead into or out of, explaining why finding it on wheels was so impossible. This is where the final chapter will play out. You play as a cat running around, listening in on the conversations of the main cast and a party of side characters you've seen over the course of the game. The main cast focusing on placing the furniture into the strange shell of a home to complete the order, and the side characters making a grave for 2 horses that had just passed away a day before in a freak storm, which explains the flooding. The reason for wanting to give them a proper burial is because the horses have been there since before anybody could remember, and always stuck around, so it felt like the right thing to do. During this chapter, you overhear the 2 parties talking about what they plan to do once this is all over, which is all up to you, the player. You'll also occasionally come across these shadows, phantoms from the past, inhabitants of the town, walking around and doing actions and talking about events from a long, long time ago. All the shadows seem to have one thing in common, and it's that they cared about this place and all of its inhabitants. Eventually, the grave is finished, and the ceremony is held. At this ceremony, a girl begins to sing a song she made for the horses, during which the specters begin to appear one by one to pay their respects. I still have a really hard time explaining why I felt such a strong and strange emotion during this scene. The horses didn't have a name, they were just called the strangers because their name wasn't anybody's to give. Apparently, they had been there since the first people that made this town, the people of nothing. Those people had set these horses free as their first experiment, and ever since then the horses have been around, until today. Now there are no more strangers left. Burying these horses is like burying the town. The ceremony ends and the specters begin to fade. Then everybody moves over to the house at 5 Dogwood Drive, finally filled with furniture, meaning the delivery has been completed. Earlier, Shannon said something that had stuck out to me. She found the furniture that had been ordered to be strange, and said that setting it in a house is almost like trying to reverse engineer a person. Filling up an empty house with furniture and trying to come up with what the original person had envisioned. Wouldn't that just make you the same as that person then? She might be talking specifically about the house, but the same applies for the town they're in. Literally a ghost town. It's been abandoned, found, and re-abandoned countless times. Each time, new faces re-envisioned what they want to do with that place. And this time around, it's up to you to decide whether or not that will continue. As to what exactly happened across the journey to 5 Dogwood Drive and what it meant, who knows? Was it maybe a story about finding a feeling of community? Perhaps it was about the American spirit, or simply just a tale about debt. Either way, the main act closes here as the camera begins to fade. Conway's final delivery completed, and the events of what happened across the Zero being given a proper burial.
For glory to him who died for me, I'm going that way.
To my surprise, Kentucky Road Zero has an epilogue. Its title is The Death of a Hired Man, based directly on a poem of the same name, a poem that shares very similar ideas with this game. In The Death of a Hired Man, an old farmhand named Silas decides to keep coming back to do his job despite no longer being physically capable. Though the poem is about Silas, it takes place solely from the perspective of the 2 farm owners, a couple. They call Silas a worthless and unfortunate human being because despite his old age, he really is good for nothing besides farm work and he can't even do that anymore. And despite how old he is, he's got nothing to show for it and no one out there cares about him. The Death of a Hired Man is an amazing poem and I recommend that you read it. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you're interested. Eventually, the husband of the farm goes out to check on Silas because he's been quiet for a while. When the husband comes back, it turns out that Silas is dead. The Death of a Hired Man is a very depressing poem, and Kentucky Road Zero is a very depressing game. The epilogue pretty much goes beat for beat with the poem and even uses one of the poem's most famous quotes. So, come the end of it, when a janitor that's cleaning up the bathroom is being too quiet, and one of the characters gets up to go check on him, I was fully expecting Kentucky Road Zero to end off the same way as the poem. But to my surprise, the man comes back and simply says that the janitor was just resting. And he says he could keep resting for a while. After all, it's not that busy and he seemed tired, thus giving the janitor a small reprieve. This ending leaves the game with a sweeter taste, albeit still very dry. You know, now that I'm looking back on it, it makes a lot more sense. Kentucky Road Zero might not have any gameplay, it might not have a grandiose story, it might not be the prettiest game, and it might not make sense in many cultures. Yet, despite all that, after finishing Kentucky Road Zero, I was left with many thoughts, none of which wanted to come out and be heard. I can't say for certain what the game left me feeling like, but I can say, it really did leave me speechless. I won't be forgetting about the Zero. Not for a long time.